The rain had been falling for hours, turning the forgotten alley into a shallow river of mud and broken glass. In the shadows, curled against a dented trash bin, a dog with fur matted into knots shivered, as if the storm itself was trying to erase him. His ribs pressed sharply against his thin skin, each breath a tremor of survival. Each sound of passing footsteps a dagger of hope quickly dulled by disappointment. He did not bark anymore. He had learned that his voice carried no weight in a world that had walked past him too many times. His eyes, though, those amber pools still carried the memory of something brighter. A reflection of what life had once been before abandonment became his only companion. The streetlight above flickered, and for the briefest moment, his gaze seemed to plead into the night, "See me. Don't let me disappear here." Somewhere in that silent storm, a fate was already shifting. A hand was waiting, though he could not know it yet, to pull him back from the edges of forgotten years. The city moved around him like a living machine that no longer needed his presence. Horns blared, footsteps echoed, and conversations floated past, but none of it belonged to him. His body had grown thin, carved by hunger and weather into something almost skeletal. For once soft had hardened into a tangled coat of mud and dust, a natural armor against nights that bit colder than memory could bear. He remembered warmth, not clearly, but as one remembers the taste of a fruit long vanished. Somewhere years ago, a hand had stroked him. A voice had called him by name, and he had belonged. Now he belonged to nothing but the silence between raindrops. Every night the alley gave him its gifts. The sour smell of rotting food, scraps tossed carelessly, the hiss of pipes leaking steam into the damp. He curled himself tightly, a creature trying to fold smaller, invisible. Yet invisibility never truly came. Children walking past pointed at him once, laughing cruelly, and a man had thrown a bottle his way. Since then, he had learned to look away first, to shrink before the world could remind him again that he was unwanted. But even as years blurred together, survival burned dimly inside him. His ears pricked at every sound, his legs tensed at every shadow. He was a ghost of a dog, but ghosts endure. The rain ran into his eyes, and still he kept watch, because some stubborn part of him refused to believe this alley was where his story would end. The night she first saw him, the rain had just ended. The streets still glistened with puddles that caught the reflection of neon signs and the tired glow of street lamps. She wasn't supposed to be walking that way. Her usual route home was brighter, lined with shop windows and chatter spilling out of cafes. But something had pulled her down the quieter street. Perhaps habit, perhaps chance, or perhaps the kind of invisible thread that fate ties between two souls before they ever know they will meet. Her footsteps echoed against the damp pavement. She had her coat drawn tightly, her scarf wrapped high against her chin. The world felt heavier than usual that evening. She carried silence in her chest, the kind that comes after months of trying to smile through losses no one else could see. That was when she heard it. Not a bark, not a whimper, but the faint scrape of claws against concrete. She turned. He was there, half shadow, pressed against the dented trash bin as if he could merge with it. His eyes caught the weak glow of the lamp above, amber and alive despite the wreckage of his body. Their gazes locked, and something inside her paused. She had seen strays before, dozens of them moving like ghosts through a city's back streets, but this was different. This was not a passing glance. This felt like recognition, as if two broken pieces of the world had finally stumbled into one another. He didn't move toward her. He didn't growl either. His body was tense, a trembling arc of suspicion and hunger. She lowered her eyes, not wanting to frighten him, then slowly knelt down onto the wet pavement. Her hand dipped into her pocket where a granola bar rested, the only food she had with her. She unwrapped it carefully, broke off a piece, and set it down on the ground between them. The dog's nose twitched. His body leaned forward, then snapped back, the war inside him written in every twitch of muscle. He wanted it. The scent was undeniable, but years of betrayal had taught him that reaching out came at a cost. She said nothing, only sat still, her hand resting on her knee, her eyes soft but steady. Time stretched, the whole alley holding its breath. Finally, hunger overruled fear. He crept forward, paws soundless against the pavement, each step a negotiation between instinct and survival. He took the piece of food, snatched it with the speed of desperation, then retreated back to his corner. Chewing quickly, his gaze never left her. She smiled, not wide, not triumphant, just a quiet curve of relief. Something fragile had shifted. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first thread of a bridge. Thin as silk, stretching between two lives that had been wandering separately in their loneliness. And in that dim alley, beneath the flickering light, she whispered words he could not understand, but somehow felt, "You are not invisible to me." The next morning she returned. It wasn't planned, not at first, but when she woke, his eyes haunted her thoughts. Those amber sparks in the dark had followed her into dreams, unsettling and tender at once. She packed a small bag before leaving her apartment, a bottle of water, a bowl she didn't mind parting with, a sandwich wrapped in foil. She told herself it was just to ease her conscience, just to help him once. But her heart already knew it wasn't going to be once. He was there, as if the alley itself had claimed him. When she appeared, he lifted his head, ears twitching, body taut as a bowstring. The moment stretched like glass between them. She crouched low, set the bowl of water down, placed the sandwich near it, and then, as before, she simply waited. The dog's stomach twisted with need. He could smell the bread, the meat, the sharp edge of something that promised relief. But his paws rooted to the ground. He had learned to survive not only on scraps but on suspicion, and every kindness he had ever reached for had cut him. Still, the gnaw of hunger was merciless. Step by trembling step, he edged closer until at last he seized the food and retreated, the way a shadow retreats when morning light breaks. Day after day, she came back. Sometimes with chicken broth poured over rice, sometimes with nothing more than gentle words carried in a steady voice. And day after day, he inched closer. Trust was not a leap for him, it was 1,000 tiny steps, each one heavier than the last. He began to recognize her scent. Not just soap and fabric, but something quieter, the faint tremor of sadness she wore like perfume. When the moment finally came, it was unremarkable in its silence but monumental in its meaning. She extended her hand, palm open, fingers soft. He froze. His ribs rose and fell, his chest rattling with the weight of decision. Then, with a slowness that felt like time itself holding its breath, his nose brushed her skin. Just once. A ghost of contact. She did not move, did not cage him in joy. She only let him feel that her touch carried no danger. It took weeks more before he followed her out of the alley. The first time, she walked a few steps ahead, her body angled sideways so he wouldn't feel trapped. She didn't call or pull. She simply let him choose. And after a hesitation long enough to break her heart, his paws lifted, and he trailed behind her. Not close enough for comfort, but close enough to matter. Her apartment was small, cluttered with the weight of a life paused. Books stacked on chairs, dishes drying unevenly in the rack, a plant leaning toward the only window with stubborn resilience. She left the door ajar, stepping inside without looking back, giving him space to decide. For a long moment, he stood in the doorway, the smells of warmth and home flooding him. Coffee, old wood, the faint trace of lavender. He trembled as though the threshold were a cliff. Then, inch by inch, he crossed it. The first night he did not sleep. He curled in a corner. Ears pricked at every sound. The creak of the radiator, the whisper of cars passing below. The soft sigh of her breath when she finally fell asleep on the couch, too afraid to leave him alone. He did not close his eyes, but he did not run. That was enough. Learning trust became a ritual. She placed his meals at the same time each day, her movements slow, her voice even. She never forced a leash, never reached too fast. When he flinched, she gave him space. When he growled low with fear, she didn't scold. She spoke his language, patience, silence, presence. Little by little, he began to unfold. A tail wagged once, tentative. A paw stretched toward her hand before recoiling. And on a morning thick with sunlight spilling across the rug, he lay his head against her knee for the first time. Her eyes blurred, tears running freely, because in that simple weight of his trust, she felt the walls around her own heart beginning to crumble too. Trust, he taught her, was not a straight road but a jagged path, where every step forward could tumble them 2 steps back. On the second week in her home, A door slammed from the apartment above, and he bolted, nails scraping the hardwood, body colliding with the kitchen table. Plates rattled. One fell and shattered. His chest heaved, eyes wild, as though the world had snapped back into the cruelty of alleys and bottles thrown. She didn't approach him, didn't corner his fear. Instead, she lowered herself to the floor, slow as the settling dust, and whispered, "It's okay, it's okay." Her voice a fragile rope stretching across the chasm between them. For hours he would not come near. But when midnight came and the silence of the city returned, she woke to find him curled just a few feet away, not touching, but close enough to feel her breathing. The days turned into rhythms. Morning light spilling through blinds, the soft scrape of kibble poured into a bowl, his cautious approach, his retreat to the corner to eat where no hand could reach him. In the evenings, she would read aloud, not for him to understand the words, but for him to learn the cadence of her calm, the reassurance that voices need not carry harm. Her loneliness began to dissolve into those rituals. She had been adrift herself, abandoned in her own way by people who promised permanence and left with silence, and in his presence, her emptiness found a mirror. Caring for him gave her a purpose deeper than her grief. Sometimes he tested her resolve. A low growl if she moved too suddenly, a flash of teeth when the leash brushed his side. Her neighbors whispered questions, warnings about keeping a street dog, their voices laced with doubt. But she looked into his eyes and saw something they couldn't. Not danger, but damage, not malice, but memory. She told herself, if I give up on him, I'm giving up on the part of me that still believes in second chances. Progress came in fragments. One morning, as she set down his water bowl, his tail swept once against the floor. It startled them both. He froze, as if embarrassed by his own hope. She pretended not to notice, though her chest ached with joy. Another evening, during a storm, thunder cracked so violently that the windows shook. He darted beneath the table, shaking, his body curled into the shape of old fears. This time, she slid down beside him. Carefully, she extended her hand into the dark space between them. And for the first time, he didn't flinch. He let her fingers rest lightly against his fur, his trembling slowly easing, her own heartbeat steadying with his. The bond grew not in grand gestures, but in those quiet surrenders. His ears began to soften when she spoke. His paws stretched across the rug instead of tucking under him in defense. At night, when the moon laid pale light across her apartment, she sometimes woke to find him closer. Inch by inch, his sleeping form drifting nearer until one dawn, he lay pressed against the couch where she slept. She reached down, brushed his head with the gentlest stroke, and he did not pull away. It was then she realized they were saving each other. She had taken him from the alley, but he had drawn her from a silence just as dark. And though both of them still carried scars too deep to name, in the fragile rhythm of trust, they had begun to stitch something new together, something like belonging. There were still nights when the old alley seemed to call him back. She would wake to the sound of claws scratching lightly at the front door. His body pressed against it as if he longed for the familiarity of his prison. Freedom, after all, was terrifying to a creature who had only known survival. She didn't drag him away, didn't scold him. Instead, she would sit down beside him in the quiet hours before dawn, resting her back against the door, her hand lying palm up near his paws. Sometimes he ignored her. Sometimes he inched close enough to rest his chin in her palm before drifting into uneasy sleep. Those nights taught her patience in ways she had never known before. Love, she was learning, was less about holding on and more about waiting, even if it meant sitting in the dark. Bath time was their greatest battle. The first attempt ended with water sloshed across the floor, towels abandoned, and her arms lined with shallow scratches from his panic. His body remembered cold rain and the weight of filth, but not the gentleness of warm water. She cried quietly that night, not from pain but from the fear that she had pushed him too far. Yet the next week, she tried again. Slower this time, letting him sniff the faucet, wetting only her hands before brushing them across his fur. Inch by inch, he surrendered, until at last he stood still beneath the stream, trembling but unresisting. When it was done, his coat glistened for the first time in years, and he shook himself free, drops scattering across the bathroom tiles like tiny jewels. She laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months, and in the corner, tail wagged once, hesitant but undeniable. Visitors were another mountain. The first time a friend came over, his body stiffened, lips pulling back to reveal teeth worn from years of gnawing scraps. He barked, the sound harsh and jagged, and she hurried her friend out before fear undid months of progress. Later that night, when he hid beneath the bed, she lay down on the floor and whispered, "You're safe. No one's going to take you away." The words were as much for her as for him. In her own past, people had entered her life with smiles and left without goodbye, and she too had learned to snarl at the idea of trust. She stroked the floorboards near him, her voice steady, and eventually his breathing slowed. It wasn't all sorrow. Joy crept in quietly, almost shy. One morning, she opened the curtains to let the sun pour across the rug, and he stretched himself long in its warmth, his belly exposed, a gesture of vulnerability that stunned her. She knelt beside him, traced the line of his ribs with her eyes, and marveled at how far they had come from that trembling shadow in the alley. She didn't touch him at first, afraid to break the spell. But when she did, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in calm surrender. For the first time, it felt like he had given her a piece of himself without fear of losing it. By the third month, he began to follow her from room to room, not because he feared being left, but because he wanted to be near. The rhythm of paws against hardwood became her new soundtrack, and a gentle percussion to her mornings and nights. He even found a place at her feet while she worked at the table, his head resting on her slippers, as if anchoring himself to her presence. And when she caught herself reaching down absent-mindedly to stroke his fur, she realized that her own walls had crumbled without her noticing. Their bond was no longer built only on survival. It was beginning to look like love. Fragile, imperfect, hard, won, but love none of the less. And though both still carried shadows that stirred at sudden noises or lonely thoughts, they were no longer ghosts wandering separate streets. Together, they had begun to step into the light. For a while, it felt as though the worst was behind them. Each day carried a new rhythm of quiet victories, the dog's head nudging her hand for affection, his tail beating softly when she came through the door, the way he sometimes sighed and stretched long across the rug, as if finally remembering what it was to feel safe. But scars are not erased by comfort. They linger like shadows, waiting for the right angle of light to return. The first crack came with a sound. It was early evening when fireworks burst across the city sky, sharp explosions splitting the calm. She was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot of soup, when the first boom shattered the air. He was gone in an instant, his body colliding with the table, claws scrambling against the floor. She found him wedged beneath the bed, eyes wild, chest heaving as if the walls themselves had betrayed him. No coaxing worked that night. She lay flat on the floor, whispering until her voice went raw, but his trembling never stopped until exhaustion finally claimed him. In that silence, she understood no matter how much love she gave, his past would always speak through him. And her own past whispered too. She had built her life around walls. The friends who had left, the love that had withered without explanation, the long hours of silence in her apartment before he came. When he recoiled from her touch, when his eyes darted with suspicion, it awakened her own fears. What if I'm not enough to heal him? What if love is never enough? Days became heavier after that. He startled at every sudden sound. The slam of a car door, the crash of a dropped pan. His trust seemed to fray, and so did hers. One morning, she tried to clip a leash onto his collar, hoping to take him beyond the small orbit of her apartment. But the click of metal sent him into a panic, teeth flashing, his growl sharp and unfamiliar. She pulled her hand back in time. But the sting wasn't in the near bite. It was in the realization that the dog she loved still believed he had to fight her to survive. She sat down on the floor, tears cutting silently across her cheeks. He stood at a distance, ears flat, panting hard, the smell of fear thick in the room. And in that moment, she recognized herself in him more than ever. How many times had she pushed people away who tried to love her? How many times had she chosen loneliness over the risk of loss? They were reflections of each other. Both abandoned, both learning to trust, both terrified of being hurt again. Healing, she realized, was not a straight road. It was a circle looping back on itself, forcing you to confront the same shadows again and again. She didn't try to fix him that night. She simply curled on the couch with her knees drawn to her chest and let him watch her cry. Hours later, when the apartment had quieted, she felt a warm weight against her foot. He had crept closer, not touching her hand, but close enough to share the silence. That was his way of saying what words could not. I'm still here. I'm trying too. From then on, she stopped chasing quick victories. She accepted the setbacks as part of their story. Some days were full of sunlight and wagging tails. Others were shadowed by growls, trembling, or the distance in his eyes. But each time, no matter how far he pulled away, he always returned, and so did she. It wasn't perfection. It was persistence. Together, they carried the weight of the past not as chains, but as reminders they were survivors. And survival had carved them into something stronger than loss. The healing they found wasn't in forgetting but in learning. Slowly, that scars could live alongside love. The seasons shifted before either of them noticed. Winter's chill gave way to the green breath of spring. And suddenly the world outside her window was alive again. She had stopped measuring their progress in victories or failures. She had begun to measure it in mornings. Every day he was still there, curled at the foot of her bed. Was another day he had chosen her over the alley. Another day they had chosen each other. One morning, sunlight poured through the blinds in golden stripes. She opened her eyes to find him sprawled across the rug, his belly exposed, paws twitching in some dream only he could see. The sight made her laugh softly, a sound she hadn't realized still lived in her. She rose, poured coffee, and sat on the floor beside him, her hand resting lightly on his chest. His eyes blinked open, and instead of fear, they held something else. Something steady, something that spoke of belonging. He stretched his neck, pressing his nose into her palm. Their first walk outside was clumsy. He froze at every noise, every bicycle wearing past, every rustle of leaves in the breeze. But she stayed with him, step by step, never pulling, never rushing. By the end of the street, his tail had lifted, swaying slowly like a flag of surrender. When a child ran up, small hand reaching for him, she tensed. But he didn't recoil. He sniffed gently, then sat waiting. The child giggled, and her heart nearly broke with the beauty of it. Home no longer meant walls or furniture. It meant the quiet rituals they built together. His head in her lap while she read, his paws thumping against the floor in sleep, the warmth of his body curled against her side during storms. She began inviting friends again, unafraid of his growl, because now he greeted them with curiosity instead of terror. Life, once empty and echoing, filled itself with the steady rhythm of his presence. On a summer afternoon, she found herself watching him through the window. He was stretched in the garden, sunlight gilding his fur, eyes half closed as bees drifted lazily in the air. He looked nothing like the shadow she had first found pressed against that trash bin. His ribs no longer jutted, his fur gleamed, and his body no longer folded in on itself. He was whole, not because his past had vanished, but because he had found a place where it no longer defined him. And she, too, had changed. The loneliness that once weighed like an anchor had lightened. She no longer feared the silence of her apartment, because it was no longer empty. She had given him a home, but he had given her something greater. Proof that healing was possible, that brokenness was not the end of the story. That evening, as the sun sank low, she sat on the couch, and he leapt up beside her. Not tentative, not seeking permission, but as if he knew it was his place. He laid his head against her chest, his breath steady, his trust absolute. She wrapped her arms around him, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of gratitude. The dog who once hid in shadows had found his light, and the woman who once lived in silence had found her voice again. Together, they had built something that could only be called home. And as the night settled around them, she whispered into his fur, words carried on a breath of love. You're safe now, you're mine, and I'm yours. Time did not erase the past, but it softened its edges. By autumn, the dog had become a presence so woven into her days that she could no longer imagine her life without the rhythm of his paws or the sound of his breath filling the quiet rooms. His place was everywhere, sprawled across the kitchen floor while she cooked, padding after her into the bedroom, curling himself in the hallway as though guarding the heart of the home they had created together. The first time he barked at the doorbell, it startled her, not the sound itself, but the realization of what it meant. He wasn't barking out of fear anymore. He was announcing himself, claiming this space as his own. For years, he had belonged to no one, to nowhere, drifting like a shadow in alleys that had no memory of him. Now, at last, he belonged. She began taking him further on their walks. At the park, he discovered the grass, the way it bent and sprang beneath his paws, the way the wind carried scents of 1,000 untold stories. Children pointed, strangers smiled, and though he stayed close to her side, his tail rose high, wagging with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, he ran, truly ran, across the open field, his body a streak of freedom, ears flying, tongue lolling in joy. She watched with tears streaming down her face, the image burning into her heart like a promise kept. In quiet moments, his transformation was even more profound. He had once slept curled tight, as if bracing for the world's cruelty. Now, he sprawled across her bed, belly exposed, paws reaching in unguarded surrender. Sometimes, he dreamed, paws twitching, muffled barks spilling into the dark. And she would rest her hand gently on his back until he stilled, until his breathing fell into the calm rhythm of peace. It struck her then love had not erased his memories, but it had rewritten their meaning. Fear no longer ruled him, trust did. Her own life had shifted just as deeply. She found herself inviting laughter back into her home, friends, family, even neighbors who once warned her against taking in a lost cause. They saw now what she had always seen, not a broken stray, but a soul that had fought for survival and finally found rest. And with each smile, each shared moment, she realized she too had been rescued. The silence that once suffocated her was gone. She no longer drifted through her days like a ghost. She had purpose. She had companionship. She had love. One winter evening, snow drifted past the windows in silent flakes, and the two of them sat together by the fire. He rested his head on her lap, his amber eyes glowing in the firelight. She traced the line of his fur, marveling at how far they had come. From that trembling figure in the rain, soaked Allie to this creature of warmth and belonging. The fire crackled, shadows danced, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. She knew there would still be hard days. Shadows don't vanish, they linger, waiting. But she also knew something stronger lingered now. Love, steady and unyielding. Whatever storms would come, they would weather them together. As midnight settled and the house fell into perfect stillness, she whispered once more into his fur, the words that had carried her from the beginning. You are not invisible. You are home. And this time, as if he finally understood, his tail thumped softly against her leg before he drifted into dreams. Spring returned with quiet insistence, painting the city in green and gold. The dog had been with her for nearly a year now, though neither of them counted days anymore. Their lives had merged into a rhythm, so natural it felt as though it had always been this way, two souls, stitched together not by chance, but by the unseen threads of survival and grace. She often caught herself watching him in still moments. The way he stretched in morning light, toes splayed, body long with contentment. The way he rested his chin on the windowsill to watch the world go by. Ears twitching at passing birds, tail sweeping against the floor in a gentle, absent rhythm. These were the gestures of a creature who finally felt safe. And each time she saw them, her chest swelled with quiet gratitude, because once, not long ago, she had feared he would never know peace. The city remembered him differently. Some neighbors still shook their heads, murmuring that not every stray could be saved. But they didn't see what she saw the way he leaned into her hand now. The way his amber eyes softened. The way his presence filled the emptiness in her home with something unspoken, but undeniable. It wasn't just rescue. It was resurrection. One evening, they ventured further than before, into the hills just outside the city, where the streets gave way to open fields. The sun hung low, bleeding orange across the horizon, and the air smelled of earth and wildflowers. She unclipped his leash with trembling fingers, half afraid he might bolt, half desperate to see him free. For a breathless moment, he stood still, ears high, eyes wide at the expanse before him. Then he ran. He tore across the grass like a storm loosed from chains, muscles rippling, fur shining as the wind carried him higher and higher into the open. She stood rooted, tears streaming, watching the ghost of an alley dog become something more, something alive, something limitless. When at last he circled back, panting, tongue lolling, he barreled straight into her arms, pressing his weight against her as though he had always belonged there. That night, back home, she lit a single candle on the table and sat with him curled at her feet. Shadows danced on the walls, soft and warm. She thought about the alley where she had found him, about the rain, about those eyes that once pleaded into the dark "See me. Don't let me disappear here." And she realized that moment had been more than chance. It had been a doorway. Now, as he snored softly against her leg, she felt the truth settle deep in her bones. She hadn't just saved him. He had saved her too. His trust, fragile and hard-won, had taught her to trust again. His resilience had reminded her of her own. And his love, quiet, wordless, but fierce in its loyalty, had shown her that broken things could become whole again, not in spite of their scars, but because of them. Outside, the city buzzed, unaware of the small miracle breathing steadily inside her home. She leaned down, pressing her forehead to his, whispering into the stillness, "We found each other." And that was enough. The dog stirred, tail sweeping once across the floor. And in that simple gesture, she felt the circle close, from abandonment to belonging, from loneliness to love.